Welcome to our In Focus discussion tonight on Disability Pride Month. It's an annual observance during the month of July to promote visibility and awareness of the positive pride felt by people with disabilities. People with disabilities are the largest and most diverse group within our population, representing all abilities, ages, races, ethnicities, religions, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Tonight, we open this space for 3 Utahns living with disabilities to discuss what they feel is most important about this topic. Kicking off our conversation tonight is Kelly Hess. She is the Utah School to Work Project Coordinator for the Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice at Utah State University. Kelly, thank you so much for being here tonight and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rosie.
Now, Kelly, the month of July is Disability Pride Month. What is Disability Pride and what does it mean to you?
I think disability pride means something different to every person, and I think maybe that the thoughts around disability pride may even shift within an individual over a lifetime. I know it has for me. So right now for me, in my life, disability pride means accepting and embracing all the aspects of my disability that makes me unique from other people. It includes moving away from feelings of embarrassment or awkwardness about the way my body looks, or even the tools that I need, the technology and the accommodations I need to be my best and live my best life.
Thank you for sharing that answer, and you're right. The definition of disability pride and what it means to each person is unique, and that's why I love asking each person that question, because they all have their own unique answers. Kelly, can you talk about expanding disability pride by shifting societal perceptions of disability?
Yeah, I think that pride expands with awareness and exposure to people with disabilities. Disabilities isn't really something that people think about unless it's connected to their life. But I encourage people to talk with people who do identify as having a disability, have conversations with them, ask questions, become friends with them, and I think, and also move away from any assumptions they might have about what disability is. I think when people make that effort, then they might be surprised at how wrong their perceptions were, and they'll probably realize that they have a lot in common with people who have disabilities, and they'll recognize that we have more alike than differences between us.
Now, Kelly, you say ask questions, and that's something that I've thought about too. Sometimes my hesitation with asking questions is I want to be as respectful as possible. How does someone approach that? How does someone ask those questions without making the other person feel othered, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. No, that's a great question, and I think that people, that's a common concern that people have, but I always, even if you don't know the right words to say, just remember that people are people, and try to think, if you were that person, what would you want, how you want people to approach you. I always encourage questions. I think that goes a long way in promoting awareness and education. So I love it when people ask me questions about myself, and even ask me, tell me about yourself, tell me about your disability, tell me why you use a wheelchair, tell me about your ventilator. And that's a respectful way to get to know somebody. There's no reason to avoid or pretend that the disability isn't there, but just by,
sometimes that does more damage by pretending like it's not there.
Yeah, for sure. And so just to say, tell me more, that tells me that you want to know more about who I am. And you can also ask other questions that are unrelated to the disability, because like I said, people are people, and I have a disability, but that's just one element of who I am.
I love that so much. Thank you for sharing that with us. Kelly, I'd like to shift now to accessibility. What does accessibility really mean?
Well, I think that when we think about accessibility, our first thoughts kind of go to devices that we need to gain access. I use a wheelchair, so ramps, door openers, elevators, things like that are a vital part and a needed part of accessibility, but I think we need to expand our lens of what accessibility is. Accessibility, it's not just an accommodation. Accessibility equals access and equals equality. And so I think that when we work towards accessibility, we're reaching towards inclusion. And when we make that effort, we're saying that people with disabilities are a vital part of a larger group, and we want them to be part of our community, part of our society, and we want them to be there at the table. So whether it be, hiring somebody who has a disability, or just making friends with somebody who's different, all of those kind of feed into that concept of accessibility.
Well said. Kelly, we have about 30 seconds left, but I really want to get to this last question.
Yeah.
I'm going to combine two questions into one. How do we as a society work towards social change for people living with disabilities? And how do we write a new narrative on what life with a disability looks like?
I think that all of us have perceptions of what disability is, but we need to look at developing new perceptions. We do that by having conversations. We do that by hearing from real people that have disabilities and hearing their stories and letting go of the assumptions that we might be hanging on to. I think that sometimes people think about disability as being something tragic, and it's definitely not. And I would love to see people kind of moving away from that and really looking at who people are and getting to know a person and all the elements that make up a person's life. Because kind of like I said, a disability is a big part of who I am, but that's just one piece of a much larger life and person.
Thank you so much for sharing that very good food for thought tonight. All right, you've been hearing from Kelly Hess. She is the Utah School to Work Project Coordinator for the Institute for Disability Research, Policy and Practice at Utah State University. Kelly, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation tonight. We really enjoyed having you.
Thank you, Rosie.
We'll be right back. Thanks for staying with us for our second In Focus discussion tonight on Disability Pride Month. Up next in our conversation tonight is Eric Stoker. He is the Information Specialist for the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council. And Eric, thank you so much for being here tonight. We're glad to have you.
It's my pleasure, Rosie. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. Eric, what does it mean to be a self-advocate, and how did you get involved with becoming a self-advocate?
Well, Rosie, being a self-advocate means talking about what you want to see happen in your life, and it means going out and advocating for yourself and for others about issues like transportation, housing, and employment, and people with disabilities face, and to advocate for ourselves about making our own decisions. And how I got involved with being a self-advocate was I was a 9th grader in middle school, and I advocated for a bus route, and I told them I wanted for it to be changed, and so I told them and I explained to them what the scenario was, and they put me on a different bus, which was really a great experience, though, and it got me a little bit closer to home instead of traveling all across the valley somehow. And after I did that, I progressed into being involved with People First of Utah, which is a self-advocacy organization here in the state of Utah. And they got me involved with learning about how to voting, explaining the issues about what people with disabilities are facing, and talking to legislators. And as time progressed, I served on numerous boards like the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council, the Utah Parent Center Board of Directors, and the Utah Special Education Advisory Board. That's just to name a few of the boards, because the list goes on and on. It's like there's a ton of boards that I served on and stuff, though. And I also serve on a group called URLEND, which is Utah Regional Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, which is based out of the Utah State University Institute on Disability. And it's really fun to be a part of it, though. I'm the consumer faculty for them, and also I serve with the Advocates as Leaders Speakers Network, which is a group of self-advocates that go out and train people with disabilities and others in our communities and just tell them about issues that are on our plate.
I love that. You have a very impressive advocacy resume, so congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Eric, let's talk about the workplace. Why is it so important for us to be inclusive of people with disabilities in the workplace?
Well, for me, basically, Rosie, many people with disabilities that are in the workplace have unique gifts they bring to the workplace. When they're out finding a job, they want to find their dream job they have the skills and knowledge of, and they want to be successful in the workplace like everyone else. People with disabilities have unique talents they bring to the workplace, and it's important to look past their disability and to see what their abilities are.
Now, you talked about those gifts. What are some talents that people with disabilities have?
There's a ton of talents people with disabilities have. They have the same talents like us and stuff. And everyone has a gift, and I think it's important to help recognize and grow those talents so that they can share those talents with others. Because if they share those talents, then people are going to be thinking, oh, this is a really cool talent. Maybe I should learn more about it.
So when it comes to inclusion of people with disabilities in our community, what are your thoughts on how that is right now? Are we doing a good job of that? Or is there room for improvement?
I think we're improving, but we need more room for more improvement because we need to include people with disabilities because a lot of people with disabilities have a voice to say though, because if that voice isn't heard, then how are we going to get it done?
Now, this month, on July 26th, will mark the 31st anniversary of the ADA. Can you talk about the impact or briefly comment on what you feel like it's maybe had an impact on your life or maybe your peers? What are your thoughts on it?
I think it's a great impact for our country for people with disabilities because the ADA has improved the lives of people with disabilities. Like people with disabilities can be access to the buses or transportation. They can have accommodations, employment, be involved with state and local government services and telecommunication services, and it has created a more inclusive community for people with disabilities.
Thank you for sharing that. Eric, we have time for final words. What would you like to leave our viewers with tonight?
I would say be a friend for a person with a disability in your community, because if you are a friend with a person with a disability, you have a friend for life, and you may find out that you guys may have the same interests as them. And it's a really fun experience though, because when you make a friend with a disability, you have a friend for life and you can reach out to them for input.
I love that so much. Thank you so much. You've been hearing from Eric Stoker. He is the Information Specialist for the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council. And Eric, we enjoyed hearing from you so much. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
We'll be right back. Welcome to our third and final In Focus discussion tonight on Disability Pride Month. Rounding out our conversation tonight is Matthew Wappat. He is the Executive Director for the Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice at Utah State University. And Matthew, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Logan.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure to be here.
So we want to learn more about your center. I understand you just got your new name a week ago.
We did.
The Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice.
That is right.
Tell us what your role and function is.
So the function of the Institute is we're technically what's called a University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And so every state, we're a federally designated entity that's attached to Utah State University. Every state has one of these centers, and the role of the center is to provide research, training, and service for personnel, families, people with disabilities in the state around disability issues.
So do you serve just the community at Utah State or the entire state?
Oddly enough, even though we're in Logan, we serve the local community. We also serve people across Utah, and last year, I'm just doing our annual reporting now, we worked in 46 different states last year.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, so it expands quite the distance. It's
quite the distance, yeah. We do a lot of national work as well.
Well, good for you all. Thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you.
Can you talk about disability as a universal human experience?
Yeah, this is something that I think we're starting to maybe appreciate more than we have in the past, but unlike disability is something that we're all going to experience at some point in our life.
At some point of our lives.
Yeah. So whether it's a temporary thing or whether it's a permanent thing, everybody's going to experience disability. And therefore, disability is something that doesn't just impact an abstract them. It actually is something that impacts all of us. And so disability issues are really important for everyone to pay attention to and to get involved with, because at some point, whether it's aging or otherwise, these issues are going to affect you.
Well said, and that's why we should all be thinking about it, be learning about it, and being part of that awareness effort.
You're exactly right.
What about disability as an aspect of diversity?
So this is something that has sort of been reinvigorated, especially over the past couple of years as Black Lives Matter and some of these other diversity discussions in the country have ramped up. Disability is frequently not included in those initiatives. And so we have a lot of corporations and universities and others they're frequently called DEI initiatives, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And the one thing that we see is that disability is not included in those. And disability is an aspect of identity, like Kelly brought up earlier, just like race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. Disability is something that impacts who you are, how you perceive yourself, and how you present yourself to the world. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion and everything else, it's important to remember that people with disabilities are part of that picture and should be included in those conversations.
And yes, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted you all to be here tonight, to help us learn about this and raise awareness about this topic. What are some stigmas that still exist about disabilities? And can you also talk about invisible disabilities?
Yeah, a lot of times when people think of disability, they think of some of the more visible elements, right? Somebody who uses assistive technology or something else to communicate or to get around. But there are many disabilities that are invisible, something like epilepsy, right? Where you can't see it, and yet it has a significant impact on the way that somebody lives their life. And there's particularly quite a bit of stigma around invisible disabilities because you look, quote unquote, normal, right? But yet you have things going on in your body that impact your ability to participate and to sort of do activities of daily living. And so it's really difficult, I think, for people to sometimes wrap their head around that. And there's people who still see that as something to be ashamed of, very similar, I would say, to sexuality, where somebody's reticent to share their sexuality or their sexual orientation, right? And they hide that aspect of their identity. There are many people with disabilities, and particularly mental health issues and invisible disabilities, who hide that aspect for fear of being judged. In fact, we did a study a couple of years ago here in Utah where we looked at disability issues in rural Utah. And one of the most common things that came up was people worried about how their community would judge them if they found out they had a particular condition. So there were people in our survey who were traveling 100 miles to pick up their antidepressant prescriptions because they didn't want the pharmacist in their little hometown to know that they'd been diagnosed with depression, because they didn't want to be judged and they didn't want to be singled out in their community. And so these are real issues that impact everybody.
And I hope one day that won't be the case. I hope one day someone can just share, hey, I have this, and someone just goes, cool, like, I'm glad I learned that about you. You know, that's really what our goal is here today. Matthew, how does mental health, also, you talked about this, let's expand on it. How does mental health fall under the scope of disability, and what does masculinity have to do with it?
So when we talk about disclosing disability, males particularly have a difficult time saying, you know what, I'm not whole, I'm not, something's wrong. And so there's actually a lot more judgment and stigma with males, and there's this idea that, right, if you're depressed and you can't get out of bed, you just need to man up, right? Just suck it up and get out there and do it. And so unfortunately, males, particularly with mental health, have a significant struggle with sharing their experience, with acknowledging the impact of mental health struggles on their day-to-day life, and with really seeking the help that they need. One of the things that we've seen is that particularly suicide among middle-aged males is on the increase. And in the western states here like Utah, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, the rate of suicide in particularly middle-aged males is about twice the national rate. And a big part of that is due to males being reticent to seek help for mental health issues.
Wow. Thank you so much for everything that you're discussing in this conversation to educate us. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we have really enjoyed having you on this show.
You.
Folks, you've been hearing from Matthew Wappat. He is the Executive Director for the Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice at Utah State University. And Matt, thank you for collaborating with us on this segment. It was so informative and insightful for us.
Thank you, Rosie.
Thank you.